Hello, and welcome back to our autumn webinar series, which we've retitled Skills for the Future, Fostering Talent and Diversity. I'm Polly Williams, Head of Diversity and Inclusion here at the Academy, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So before the summer, we heard from some wonderful guest speakers on a range of topics covering schools, technical and higher education, affecting science and engineering skills. And if you missed any of those webinars and would like to watch them, you can find them and all of our other webinars on our events pages on the Academy's website. So a bit of housekeeping before we start. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be published on our website, so you can watch again later. There'll be a Q&A after Dawn's talk, so please do post any questions that you have in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, either during the talk or afterwards as we go through the Q&A section. And the chat function is also open if you want to comment there. So today we're talking about inclusion in engineering, and it's a very timely topic, almost as if it was planned, as this week is National Inclusion Week. And a quick plug to mention that on Monday this week at the Academy, we launched our interactive team working series. Now, these are a series of short 1-hour workshops to help create an inclusive team culture where everybody feels valued and able to contribute their diverse perspectives. And these workshops are designed to be used by team leaders and managers within their teams in an engineering context, and they're free to use, and all the materials, including the guides for facilitators on how to run an inclusive session, session guides, slide decks, etc., are available to download on our website. And Artie from the Diversity and Inclusion team here has kindly put the link in the chat if you want to have a look there. But the focus of today is on inclusive engineering outputs and outcomes, and how to embed inclusion into engineering education to get those inclusive engineering outputs. And I'm delighted that we have Dawn Bonfield with us to talk on this topic. So Dawn is going to be talking about how we can make sure that the outputs we produce as engineers are accessible and relevant for all. She's also going to speak about inclusive teaching and learning, the decolonising the curriculum debate, as well as changes to accreditation systems which have recently embraced diversity and inclusion. And Dawn is ideally placed for this topic, as the last 3 years Dawn has been the Royal Academy of Engineering's visiting professor of inclusive engineering at Aston University. She's the founder and director of Towards Vision, which is a not-for-profit organisation working towards a vision of diversity and inclusion in engineering. She's the past president and former chief executive of the Women's Engineering Society, WES, and she's deputy chair of the Women in Engineering Committee of the World Federation of Engineering Organisations, working on the application of engineering and technology to address gender inequality globally. And she's also recently been a member of the Engineering Design T-Level panel and serves on several educational committees promoting engineering. So well qualified and well experienced, and will be a wonderful talk. So we're delighted to have Dawn with us. Once again, just a reminder before I pass over that we'll be doing the Q&A after Dawn's talk. So please do ask your questions in the box at the bottom of your screen. So enough from me, time to hand over to Dawn. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Polly. Hello. Thank you for having me this afternoon. And it's good to be here to talk about the work that the Royal Academy have enabled me to do through the visiting professorship at Aston University. So as Polly just said, this is something I've been doing for the last 3 years. And it kind of complements the rest of the work that I do that Polly mentioned. And I'll talk a little bit more about some aspects of that as I go through. So, this isn't changing very easily. I'll use the mouse. I don't need to tell you much about my background. Polly's just said all of that, but just to say that I'm a proud materials engineer. Aerospace and automotive composites is my kind of engineering background. So the things I want to talk about this afternoon, I want to kind of focus really on the inclusive engineering outputs. And I think the way I like to describe it is that there are kind of 2 sides, well, there are 3 here, but there are 2 sides to the inclusion debate, if you like. So there's what we do within engineering. So within engineering, higher education and the corporate sector of engineering. And then there is the inclusion that happens as a result of the engineering that we produce. So what happens outside of our sector, if you like. So that's what I class as engineering outputs. So outputs or outcomes. So the things that we make, or the results and the kind of sometimes unintended consequences of the things that we make and produce as engineers. So the engineering outputs and outcomes is the first bit I'm going to talk about. That's this bit in green here. Then the other two parts are what we can do within higher education at the university level. So that's the engineering teaching and learning and culture within academia. And then some of the work that I've been doing to try and influence that from the outside, if you like, so from the funding side, the accreditation side, and kind of procurement level as well. So they're the three different areas that I want to talk about this afternoon. So I will get on as quickly as I can. So inclusive engineering outputs and outcomes. So making sure that we are enabling our undergraduate engineers really to understand how they are shaping the world and what their responsibilities are, if you like, in terms of producing frameworks, services, products, solutions that are accessible and relevant for everyone, that don't have bias and discrimination built into them, that are future facing, so we are ready for the future. They are considering social values, ethics and the environment. They're globally responsible and appropriate, and they comply with this leave no one behind ethos that's very much part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's what I mean by inclusive engineering outputs. And basically it's trying to get inclusion as one of the core competencies that we have as engineers. And there's a list there of the kind of non-technical core competencies that are the background, if you like, the way that we want our engineers to think. And we're very used to thinking in a safety conscious way, for example. So, you know, that's, although we have to be taught how to think in a safety conscious way, it becomes embedded in the same way as ethics and, you know, the other things along those blocks at the bottom. Inclusion, I mean, it's not bigger than any of the others. It's just there to highlight that this is one of those kind of mindset changes that we're trying to get embedded in our future engineers. And that hopefully what will happen there is we will start at the top here with inclusive outputs, and then that mindset change will come as a result of thinking about other people. And then that will feed into the culture that we have within engineering, either higher education or within the corporate sector. And then that is what will lead us to get this more diversity and more inclusion in the sector. And I think one of the traps we fall into is we start from the box there on the left that is better equality, more diversity in engineering. And that's often a conversation that happens on a Friday afternoon, you know, 4 o'clock, rather than on a Monday morning when engineers start to do the work that they do for the vast majority of the time. So it's getting it more embedded in their, the things that they really care about as engineers. And this is the framework that I've been developing whilst I've been at Aston. So in the middle there are the products, the services, the designs, the things that we produce. And then round the edge are the other factors that we have to be considering all the time when we're thinking about new designs. So people-centered is the one that I'll talk most about today, probably up here, but other ones that I'll talk about: societal impact, future technology. But these are all really important aspects and things that, you know, we don't necessarily tell engineers in their brief, but they are things that we expect engineers, and certainly with the new framework that we're looking at for accreditation, we're expecting engineers to be bringing these things into their thought processes when they're designing. So it starts at the very beginning when we start off with a problem, and actually even before we start with a problem, it's making sure we're looking at the actual need that we're addressing. And making sure that we're kind of intelligent engineers and we are asking the right questions of the client, or really going back to the human need, and then having this creative and divergent thinking right at the start of our design process, if you like, and then opening our mind to all of these different influences before we start to converge on a solution. And this is a graph that just shows where the costs come, you know, the committed costs. The red line there shows the committed costs. Now, those committed costs need not just be monetary costs, they could be carbon costs, but they all come right at the very start of your design. So we need to make sure that we are getting this thought process really activated at the very start of the design process. So how do we go about teaching this inclusive mindset to undergraduate engineers, for example? So one of the ways is this inclusion framework that I've been developing. The second way is through self-awareness, getting engineers to realise what their own background is, what their biases are, where their blind spots are, what their unconscious biases are sometimes, and making them aware that they come from a particular perspective, and it's all about widening that perspective and asking other people to give their perspective to the problem that they're trying to address. Identity as well, helping people to own their own identity within engineering. You know, we talk a lot about wanting diversity of thought, but actually what we do when we bring diverse people into engineering is we sometimes squash that diversity of thought, and we stop people thinking from the perspective that they are bringing into engineering. So, you know, especially for women, we hear it very often that women will often say that they don't want to be thought of as a woman in engineering, but just as an engineer. And I think that's a really dangerous position to be in, because they're not bringing that identity with them, which is really important. So getting this creative thinking, showing people tools and techniques to think creatively. And then I do this at Aston through using non-inclusive examples. So, you know, what happens if we forget to do this? And legislation as well. Legislation comes in a few kind of forms, really. We've got the Equalities Act 2010, where we have 9 protected characteristics. We've got the public sector equality duty, which is the additional duty that we have if we work for any public facing organisation, or a railway, Transport for London, or any building, schools or prisons. And then we've got our own code of engineering practice and ethics. The Sustainable Development Goals are another big driver. Liability for failure is something that we need to be aware of as well. You know, clients will be expecting us to have brought into our thinking all of the things that go around the edge of the design brief. So making sure that we are aware of that, you know, so that we are producing the best solutions. And then safety as well, you know, risk management around safety. And Royal Academy had a Safer Complex Systems event last week, and diversity and inclusion came up as one of the key enablers of safer complex systems. So, you know, it's not just something that we would like to be as engineers. These are kind of legislative requirements. So that's what I've just spoken about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a few slides just of some of the examples of where things go wrong, just to get the idea of what it is that, what non-inclusive engineering can look like, for example. So this one, in terms of products, there, top left, that story is around women cosmonauts who wanted to do a spacewalk together but couldn't go out together because they didn't have enough equipment to fit the 3 women that were on the spacecraft. The middle one there is about protective equipment, PPE, stab vests and kind of military vests, which don't fit women as well as they should do, and they've not been designed for women. So the consequence of that is they don't protect women where they should, and women end up taking them off with no protection at all. The one on the right is a mobile phone charging device. That's at Loughborough University, where if you're tall with long legs, you can reach the pedals, but if you're like me, you can't reach the pedals at all. So yeah, not been tested by someone who's a bit shorter than those guys there. This one down here is the one that perhaps we all know of. It's the soap dispenser or the gel dispenser that doesn't work if your hand is black, but does work if your hand is white, because they failed to test it on a range of people. And then the other one on this slide is the seat belts, you know, the story that we're probably all familiar with, how they haven't been tested on pregnant women. These stories are around technology. So the top one there is game characters and how we are stereotyping certainly women in game characters. and how difficult it is to play a game as a woman, and the added cost of having to download something to have a woman's character. The middle one is based on the Shirley card, which was a photographic card which Kodak used when they started the photographic development. And when Shirley, who was a white woman, looked okay in that developing, people with black skin were not visible at all, really. They faded into the background, and that drove a lot of the kind of social skin whitening culture that came as a result of that. The one on the right is about facial recognition. And, you know, the implications, what are the implications of not having your face recognized because you've got black skin? And they're not kind of trivial. And I think students are really interested in discussing the kind of social aspects of what can the consequences be of not recognizing people and making them go, for example, at the airport, making them, you know, when their passport doesn't work like everyone else's, taking them to a different queue and, you know, slowing down their journey. It's the same with people with disabilities. You know, you're taking them away from the mainstream and you're giving them additional binds, if you like, to their life, which just stop them being in the majority and getting the same benefits as everyone else. Some of the other examples here, DNA sequencing, so technology that allows family members to be identified if other family members have given their fingerprints. So, you know, we know that black people get stopped more often for stop and search and their fingerprints taken. So there's a much bigger risk of criminalizing certain groups of people. The one on the bottom left is around algorithmic decision making and how the existence of these word vectors, where we have different words that congregate around certain words. And if you take a lot of the written text from, you know, from our history, if you like, it is very gendered. And, you know, you'll find a lot of examples of where we are, you know, you only need to look back a few years to see the gender stereotypes that creep into the TV programs, if you ever watch old TV programs. And they are embedded in that data. And so if we're using that historical data, we're much more likely to find decisions that are being made based on that historical data, such as women finding that they're getting adverts for low paid nursing or care jobs, for example, and men are getting more adverts in their inbox for higher paid engineers. So that's around the technology. The health sides, this book, Invisible Women, is a really interesting book around exposing data bias for women. I don't need to even tell you about the latest COVID-19 biases, if you like, that we've seen as a result of people living in different circumstances and, you know, because of their ethnic background. So there, I mean, and also this one here is the physiology of men and women, if you like. You know, there are some real differences that we have to take into account that often, you know, when we're doing research, we don't even disaggregate for gender. So we don't even sometimes know whether we're looking at data from men or women. The built environment. So this is an example, the top left, of Birmingham New Street Station. And the flooring here is very difficult to judge if you've got any visual impairment. Anything that's got kind of a black and white uniform pattern floor looks very much like steps. So that's an example of not great design. But also the one in the middle is a better example of design where you bring people together that have different needs, really, and you don't separate people off with disabilities into a different kind of stream, if you like, into the slow track. The one on the right is referring to the different modes of the different roles that people play in society. So men and women play very different roles often in society, especially women who have young families. And that's around looking at public transport and making sure that we can see the biases that might be in public transport, and especially where we've got a system that on the surface looks very equal and accessible to everyone. When you start to look a bit deeper and to look into the roles that they play in society, it becomes more obvious that actually there are biases that accumulate for certain groups of people. And then the bottom left is around how we sometimes build in exclusion, if you like, to our designs. And that's some work that we do around homeless people and how we are preventing them from keeping dry at night and sleeping on park benches, for example, or getting to parts of the city where they're not wanted. So failure of provision of flyovers, if you like, to get them from one part of a city to another, which is more affluent. I'm just going to have a sip. So as well as pointing out the downsides, if you like, this is about pointing out, you know, what we can do with technology. And oftentimes it's not just a question of making sure that we're not building biases in, it's making sure that we're actually addressing biases and addressing inequalities. So some of these are examples that we talk through around microfinance and how that's specifically targeting women who don't often get access to the traditional banking methods in order to give them small amounts of money that they can then spend on their machinery or farm machinery. Solar Sisters is around helping women get renewable energy so that they get clean cooking facilities. The one on the top right is called PlantWise, and that's helping women get access to knowledge. So if they're farmers, they know, you know, what to look for in terms of their crops and the pests that are affecting their crop. And then the bottom one is around inclusive cities and some work that ICE have done, the civils have done around identifying what inclusive cities look like for women actually. Just going back to this framework, if you like, I was talking then about the people-centered design, but just to say something about social impact and social responsibility. And this is a growing area of work really, and one that is really, really interesting, I think. We have, you know, Engineers Without Borders, Bridges to Prosperity, Practical Action, and we've got the recent World Engineering Day for Sustainable Development and a number of publications there looking at how our engineering is addressing social issues. And obviously the Sustainable Development Goals are another big driver for that. And so if we start looking at, these are the outcomes, if you like, of engineering. So not what we produce, but things that happen as a result of what we're producing. So the pollution that we produce that goes into the air or that goes into our water streams, the plastic that goes into our oceans, the fracking, and who is impacted most, you know, and often it's marginalized group and poor areas of the country that are more usually impacted by these decisions that we take, sometimes inadvertently, just, you know, in the process of doing our engineering work. We haven't stopped to think about who are the groups that are badly affected and housing conditions, you know, who is it that's living in those houses, and you know, what are the consequences of that? And I'm really, really pleased to see the Royal Academy have got an event coming up in the next couple of months, I think, or maybe next month, that is looking more at these engineering outcomes. I think I've mentioned probably all of these, but another one that's on there, the ship one, at the end of their engineered life, 90% of the world's ships and offshore structures land up on beaches. So, you know, what do we do about dismantling at the end of life as well? And how do we make sure that we're bringing that into the design right at the very start? This is just an aside, really, just to say that I've been doing some work with UNESCO and the World Federation of Engineering Organisations on the gender perspective. I'm just looking at the clock, actually, so I've got no time to talk about that, but the website's down at the bottom there if you are interested in seeing more about that. The other thing to say about this is future trends. Make sure we're building future trends into our designs, looking at this multifunctionality of solutions so that we can include more than one thing at the same time. This is a sustainable transport solution. which has also got some renewable energy provision as well. So we're looking at two solutions at the same time. This is a sustainable a sod system, sustainable urban drainage, and also thinking about how we make sure that we are tackling obesity, health, well-being at the same time as a solution that's around drainage. Future technology as well, making sure we bring in that technology timeline when we're thinking about our designs. You know, because in lots of cases we can be bypassing and we can be leapfrogging technology that doesn't have to be iterative, especially if you're working in other countries, you know, where they don't necessarily have a system that's already built in, like, for example, the microfinance. You know, can you go directly to somebody's mobile phone with a solution? I haven't spoken about some of these other things, but you will see them around there, and that basically that's what I've been spending my time at Aston doing for these last 3 years, looking at the outputs of engineering. And I think you know, when I first started there, I think the students thought that we were going to be talking about diversity and inclusion within engineering, aka how to get more women and, you know, other underrepresented groups into engineering. And I can tell you what, they are absolutely not interested in that conversation. That's not within their power to change or to even think about. You know, they are in engineering now. They're on their career path into engineering. They want to be thinking about what they can be doing as engineers. So yeah, I would say that they are very interested in this type of conversation. So I'm just quickly going to go on to these other two areas. The first one being this engineering, teaching, learning, assessment and culture change within one higher education institution. I've split this down into 3 areas. So what we can do as an individual, what we can do for the structure as a whole, and then what we can do for the curriculum. So individual competencies, you know, this starts with every one of us, doesn't it? What we can do individual as a person to ensure that we are working as a professional engineer with inclusive behaviours. So it's defining what those behaviours look like and training people to behave in those ways, nudging people to behave in those ways, mentoring people, using gender neutral language, encouraging their identity, embedding these things in professional development reviews, having this zero tolerance culture. So, you know, individual competencies is really important in their research as well, making sure that they know where inclusion comes into their research. You know, how do they disaggregate data? How do they think about mainstreaming the gender perspective and other perspectives? So embedding inclusion in the structure of a higher education institution is all around putting it in every single policy, procedure, system, strategy, practice that you can get it into. So it becomes a process-driven change, if you like. I think we as engineers are very good at following process. So if we can get any of this into the process itself, then all the better, because people will do it without having to be convinced of any business case. Once it's there, you know, you follow that process. So just putting it in everything we possibly can, using this, you know, the charter marks, Athena Swan, the Race Equality Charter, where we can. I noticed recently that the white paper from the government had taken away the value, if you like, in some respects of these charter awards, which is unfortunate. Bias interrupters I won't talk about now, nor nudge behaviour, but maybe in the questions there'll be time for that. So culture change, this is what we're aiming for, isn't it? Culture change. Culture change is all around us. It happens in every level of the organisation with every single person. And yeah, it's making sure that we are committed to this, especially as leaders, commitment to doing it, being on it all of the time, seeing it in everything. And I think we do get to a point where we have kind of flicked the switch in our mind and we start to see it in places that we hadn't necessarily seen it before. We start to see it in slides that we get sent that aren't inclusive. We start to see it in prospectus examples that don't have any inclusion in them. You know, we get attuned, and once we're attuned, it's like safety. You don't switch that off. You have it with you all of the time. Teaching and curriculum, you know, thinking really hard about what inclusive teaching looks like, what inclusive assessment actually means, and how we get the best out of students and enable them to show how they can achieve in higher education in the same way that they would be able to achieve in the workplace. Using these new pedagogies as well. So they are, all of them really, great for embedding inclusion, auditing the curriculum for inclusion, decolonisation of the curriculum. Now that's another kind of big topic area for a whole session one time. I don't have time to talk about that now, but maybe can come back to it again in the questions. I will quickly go on to the last of these areas. So what are the external influences? What can we do above the individual university level that will impose changes, if you like, from the top level down? So this is just to show how something from the top level then cascades down from, like, accreditation at the top, the Engineering Council, down to the professional institutions and then into the universities. And I've been doing some work, Polly mentioned at the start that I'm a member of this World Federation of Engineering Organisations, WFEO, and they're doing some work with the International Engineering Alliance on the Graduate Attributes and Professional Competencies framework, which is the framework that looks at the competencies that engineers will need in the future. And that's being developed right now. So Engineering Council, which has AHEP in the UK, so the Accreditation of Higher Education Programmes, 4 is just about to come out. So the iteration after 4, AHEP 5, will have to take into account the GAPC framework. So it's a really interesting time to start setting the future vision of what we're trying to see in our future engineers, what skills they will need. And I've been involved through this WFEO group with the working group looking at those. And one of the key focus areas for change in this framework is diversity and inclusion. And I couldn't be happier to see it being embedded so strongly. Now, I'm going to go through a number of tables really quickly here. And these are the tables from the professional competencies framework. Obviously, you're not going to read what's on the screen there, but in the yellow boxes, so inclusive mindset, I can't see that because my thing's on. Inclusive mindset, taking wide-ranging perspectives into account, including future requirements, collaboration across engineering, complex problems, looking at natural resources, wide and inclusive perspective, awareness of social science, creative approach, inclusive attitude. You know, these are all really important attributes that we've identified for our future engineers. So that is really great to see that. So that's coming next. And if you do want to feed into that framework, then it's open till the 4th of December. AHEP 4 has these 2 new areas as well. So equality, diversity and inclusion is one of the 2 new areas along with security of AHEP 4. So I'm hoping that they will create some guidelines to help people understand what that looks like. And the AHEP 4 changes, not only have they built it into what we do professionally within the sector, they have also crucially shown it to be something that we need to embed in design. So that C5 there says this at the bottom: design inclusive solutions for complex problems that meet societal, user, business or customer needs. So that's really good. Right, I will do this next bit in 1 minute and then I'll be finished. So this is the last bit, is all around what else can we do to kind of impose change from the top. And this is about changes that we can put into the grant funding landscape, if you like, and the publishing landscape, because both grant allocation success and publishing success feed in really in key ways to pay gaps, promotion, equality, and, you know, the whole sector, if you like, in terms of the difference between people that get those grant allocations and the ones that don't. EPSRC, UKRI have come out with some data recently. And if you analyse that data, which is here on these statistics here, you'll say one of the things here is the difference in funding between men and women. This is thanks to Vanessa Diaz, and she shows that there's a gap, and you see the enormous gap there in funding between men and women in higher education. It's 400 million compared to 50 million. And you know, that is the power of money is the power of representation in higher education. And so, yeah, we need to really be thinking about why women and underrepresented group, BAME as well. This is some analysis from Tanvir Hussain at Nottingham, looking at principal PIs, CIs, and looking at how we don't really have any good news stories to show from the last 5 years, really. And, you know, we need to start a really good look at these statistics, I think, and see what we're going to do about that. And there are levers for embedding EDI in the funding landscape, and it's how we can work with BEIS, for example, or the UK government to make sure that we set these or embed these EDI levers into the procurement landscape and get BEIS to do the hard work in passing that down to UKRI, and then UKRI in turn pass that down to the university level. So at the end, they were the 3 areas I've spoken about, really. So hopefully I've given enough food for thought and for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and leave it to Polly to share hers.
Thank you very much, Dawn. That was a really, really interesting and wide-ranging presentation, but I really liked the kind of the pulling out of the engineering outputs versus the kind of unequal engineering outcomes, and kind of thinking that some of those examples through. So some really good examples of the kind of positive examples, but also where it's gone wrong as well. We had some questions in the chat box, but I had a question first, just to kick off with. So you talked about changing the mindset of future engineers to consider inclusive engineering outputs and outcomes. You've been looking at this as part of your visiting professorship for the last 3 years. Have you seen any improvements over kind of the last few years of looking at this in detail? And is there anyone who's doing this well, either in the UK or globally?
Oh gosh, that was a hard question, Polly, which
Sorry,
you could have warned me it was coming. It's difficult, really, because, you know, with a visiting professorship, you are there not that often, I guess, and you tend to see classes maybe only once. It's actually quite difficult to get this into the curriculum because it's not there at the moment. I'm hoping that once it finds its way into AHEP, it will be much easier to get a space in the curriculum for teaching this. But I think, you know, from my experience of speaking, and what I do at Aston is I speak to different years. So I speak to the foundation right the way through to the MSc students. So I only see them once a year, if you like. But I do know that they engage with it. They have an assignment and they have to produce a video. And the videos that they've been producing show that they are understanding what it's about. They are relating it to kind of social justice and to the examples that we look at and talk about. So yeah, I think they are interested in it, and much more so than I thought they would be when I started, I think. I think, yeah, there are people also doing, you know, there are certainly other visiting professors who work on inclusion as well. I think some of the universities in the States are doing this much more robustly and, you know, embedding it much more as part of their curriculum. I'd like us to do more, and I'd like to pass this on somehow to other universities so that they, you know, what I am doing this year is trying to compile some resources so that we can share those resources amongst other people, you know, other universities. So I would like it to be a growing subject area, I think, and I think it has the potential to do that, because I think changing the conversation is what we need at the moment. I think we've got slightly stuck in the old conversation around what diversity and inclusion is, and I think we've got to kind of jog ourselves out of that.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions in the chat box, and I encourage everyone who's listening in to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to kind of collate them together. Just to follow on from what you just said then, so some of what you were talking about kind of relates to systems engineering and kind of systems thinking, and that is that about that broader perspective, so that could take in sociology and psychology or geography, etc. So how do we change the education of engineers to take into account all of these diverse disciplines and really kind of all those different perspectives and thoughts, as well as inclusion, but kind of that broader piece?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it absolutely is systems engineering. And one of the things I think about a lot is we do need to start bringing in these kind of social science conversations as well. And we have an issue with, we talk a lot about the pipeline in engineering and getting more diversity along the pipeline. Two things that we don't do enough on is trying to get that inter-sectoral mobility. So trying to get people who are already in other sectors to join us in engineering and then start to work with us. But also, maybe we're kind of slightly elitist, thinking that they're going to join us. Why don't we join them? Why don't we join up with other disciplines, if you like, and start working together in these partnerships that would reinforce both engineering and their subjects as well. And I think that one of the barriers is around the language that we each use. And I think it's quite inaccessible often for engineers to understand the language of social science, and we have to get better at kind of translating that language so that it's relevant to us in engineering, so that we can kind of broaden our thinking really, and really embrace this kind of systems thinking, but right across different areas.
So what would success look like? That was one of the questions on the in the Q&A box. What if this is all working well, and then what would success look like? What would your vision be for that?
I think success for me looks like when we stop thinking about engineering and we start thinking about global challenges. I think sometimes we're so concerned about trying to get people to think about coming into engineering and to work in engineering, and we have lots of conversations around that. And I think it looks like success if we start to think about, what does poverty look like? What does hunger look like? How do we change these? What does inequality look like? And what are we doing to address those bigger issues in society that, affect us all and that are so well described, if you like, by the Sustainable Development Goals? So yeah, I think for me, it looks less like kind of navel gazing at what engineering is, and more like looking at, the things we read in the newspaper every day, the things we see on the television. How are we as engineers addressing those issues? So I think that's success for me.
Yeah. There were a couple of questions around some of the frameworks and kind of accreditation and things that you mentioned. So you mentioned the AHEP, and is your framework that you're developing, is that all feeding into the future iterations of that, and kind of any other policy changes or any kind of considerations around that anyone else can get involved in or support or learn more about?
Well, the framework, if the question's about the GAPC, the Graduate Attributes and Professional Competencies Framework, that's the one that's been developed by IEA, the International Engineering Alliance, and they're the ones that sit internationally, and they control those accords, the Dublin and the Washington and the Sydney Accord, that are the things that we all sign up to, so that we know that we've got consistency across all of the countries in terms of accreditation. So our accreditation has to feed in to that bigger framework, if you like. So that GAPC framework is the one that's being developed for the next iteration of that. Yeah. And so our AHEP 5, when that comes out, I mean, AHEP 4 hasn't come out yet, so this is something for the next few years. But yeah, I think the path that we're on is really important. And also the professional institutions have their own mechanism of developing guidance that feeds in, comes from AHEP 4. So like the Joint Board of Moderators and the IET will have, and others will have their own guidance, so there's no reason why their guidance actually can't also use some of the GAPC framework that we're seeing coming online. And I know JBM is already looking at kind of future skills in that same way, if you like. So get involved. They're absolutely looking for responses to the consultation, so now is the time.
Yeah, and you obviously can't fit everything into kind of formal education, engineering education, curriculum in higher education. So how much should professional development and kind of what's happening kind of out in industry or the professional development of engineers play a role in what you've been talking about? The professional engineering institutions play a role, but is there any other work or any other programs or initiatives that you've seen that are also looking at this?
That's a good question. So you mean, how do we make sure that our already graduated
current engineers,
yeah, I guess that, you know, and I haven't looked at all, but the chartered engineer status that we UK spec is the next level up for professional registration. So embedding this in UK spec, you know, we do, professional engineers are asked in their interview to give an example of where they have what they know about diversity and inclusion in engineering. And I think, yeah, trying to help with different examples of what that actually looks like, and not just, you know, in a real way, and not just, oh, well, you know, I made sure that our job adverts had the inclusion rider added. That's great, and we absolutely need to do all of that. But it's thinking about what we produce as engineers and how we are producing content and products and services that are inclusive. And I think, yeah, I think it will be really good if the professional engineering institutions can start to embed this in some of their guidance, because they all do talk about this and they all do take it really seriously. And I think sometimes that's not reflected in the training that they provide and the guidance notes or the resources that they give to their members.
Yeah. So we had a question about, do you think neurodiversity is considered sufficiently in design as well as physical disabilities? So has there been anything that's come up through your you know, looking at this around considerations of neurodiversity?
Yeah, that wasn't from Stephen, was it? Because he wants to talk to us about...
No, it wasn't, no.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I had a question prompt about dyslexia and neurodiversity as well. You know, it's not an area I'm expert on, but it's one that I know we have to get much better at. I think it was one of Mark McBride-Wright's events from Equal Engineers, where we really did focus on neurodiversity and how we need to get much better at understanding needs and the value of this absolutely superpower, if you like, within our sector, and using it to our advantage, because we're all, you know, we have to be looking for those different ways of thinking, that innovation that comes with different thought processes. So yeah, I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but it's key, absolutely key.
Great, thank you. You had one of your slides, you briefly mentioned the decolonisation of engineering and of the curriculum. What does that look like? Someone's asked from one of the questions.
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting area, I think, and not one that we've really got to grips with. For me, I think it looks like understanding who we are as engineers, what we're driven by, kind of politically and historically, and knowing why we have a certain way of prioritize, you know, what we're prioritizing, how we are doing that, how we're passing that on, possibly inadvertently, when we work in partnership with other countries. It's about making sure that we have diverse reading lists, role models, understanding that ours is not in any respect the only model for looking at the world, and just that acknowledgement and recognition that we are, coming at this from a perspective that is very much linked to our history, and how is that influencing what we do and what we should be doing, especially around social justice. You know, ethics as well. Whose ethics are we talking about? Because ethics around the world look very different in different countries. And so, you know, we are global companies often, and especially professional institutions have members all around the world. So when we're talking about ethics, making sure that it's relevant for all of our partners, really. And it's not just about colonization, that's just a kind of one part of it. It's all around this bigger conversation about being inclusive, making sure that we've got examples that are relevant, if you like, to the context. Sometimes we take engineering courses and we deliver them in other countries, lock, stock and barrel, without any thinking about whether they're actually relevant to the country that we're delivering them in, and whether the practicals that we do are relevant in other countries as well. So it's just having that awareness that, you know, there are other ways of thinking about things. And yeah, so it's I'd like to be involved more and spend some money, not my money, you know, persuade someone to spend some money doing some research, looking at this.
And we know that the kind of pace of change, I suppose, in engineering for diversity and inclusion is glacial. One of the questions that's come in is that how can we be disruptive and accelerate that pace of change, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm kind of hopeful that if we start to think of inclusion through this different mindset, then we will move on from the blockage we've had and start to then look at the bigger conversations that we could be having around diversity and inclusion. And then, you know, I think Manon Bradley said at one of the events that I was at, we need some disruption to come along and kind of move us into a different plane, if you like. And yeah, we're looking for that all of the time, aren't we? Because everything we do at the moment is iterative. And sometimes it feels like you're going, you know, a few steps back for one step forward. But yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that, and certainly for me, you know, I've been involved in diversity and inclusion for a long time, and I've never really felt as empowered as I do now when I start to think about inclusion around social justice and inequality. You know, that has opened up a whole new world for me. And I think if we can move our conversation on in that respect, it's very difficult though, because it is all linked together. You know, what you do within engineering and what you do as engineers for the outside world, they are linked together. And oftentimes, if you try to talk about inclusive engineering outputs, you can't get away from the fact that it keeps coming back to, you know, what to do about getting more diversity in engineering. It seems to kind of revert to that at the moment. But I think, I hope that the more we talk about it, the more we'll leave that behind and start to focus on something that is, yeah, more important and kind of a way of getting us to move forward more quickly.
Yeah. And a good question's come in, and I suppose I could expand on this question, but someone's asked, so Tim has asked, what is the single message you have for accrediting bodies? And I suppose I could also ask, what's the single message or one action that higher education institutions should be taking as well? What would you, the one thing that those two sides should be doing, what would you, in your opinion, be that kind of one single message or one action to really be disruptive?
For higher education institutions, you know, do something, start somewhere, take it seriously, make a plan. You know, one of the things that came out in the last few days, or even today or yesterday, I think, was that the Horizon Europe call, the new call Horizon Europe, everyone has to have a gender equality plan to apply for funding. We're going the other way in the UK, where, you know, our policy is taking away that bureaucracy and really saying, well, actually, no, you don't need the Race Equality Charter or Athena Swan, and, you know, we're not going to link it in any way, shape or form to funding. And I don't think that that's really helpful. So for a higher HE institution, I just think start somewhere, take this seriously and do everything you possibly can. You know, make a plan and stick to it and measure And I think, you know, I can't really say that strongly enough. For accrediting bodies, yeah, just teach people what to look for in this respect. I think, you know, we have the guidance there that we have to comply with. So when you're an accreditor or an external examiner, you know, and guidance would really help with this. Look for the right things when you're there, because that's another lever that you've got. We've got to get hiring HEIs to do the right thing and take it seriously.
Great, thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so before I kind of sum up, and thank you to everyone who's put their questions in the Q&A. I think we've covered most of the questions, and apologies if we've missed them, but just over to you, Dawn, for any final thoughts or words, anything you wanted to say before we finish and wrap up.
Well, thank you to the Royal Academy actually for giving me the opportunity to do this visiting professorship. So that's yeah, I wouldn't be doing this work otherwise, and yeah, I've enjoyed doing it and we'll carry on doing it. And yeah, I'm hoping that it will be the start of a bigger conversation that we have around these engineering outcomes and outputs.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So we've obviously recorded this webinar, and that will go up with the slides as well. So if you want to have a look in more detail at what Dawn's been talking through, and then you can do. So thank you once again to Dawn for a great talk and for the Q&A as well. Our next webinar will be held at the same time next week, so that's next Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m, where Jennifer Burden, Director of Programmes at Gatsby, will give a talk on an introduction to T-levels. So do join us then if you can. That's it for now. Thank you and goodbye.